Can you guys all hear me good? All right, so I'm Dave. Just quick 5 seconds about myself. I've been a developer, programmer for the majority of my life, working professionally for the last 19 years. And most recently, the last 5 years, I work at a company called InboxDollars, and I'm a web development manager slash architect slash developer. You know, I heads down in a lot of code. I work at a small company, so as many of you know that work at small companies, you wear a lot of hats. Today I'm going to talk about getting started with domain-driven design, and this is going to be, I'm going to show a lot of code and sort of a case study of, you know, where we were before we implemented DDD and where we are now. But before I dive in and start showing code, people, raise your hand if you support old code. Okay, keep your hand up if your code is older than 5 years. 10 years? 15? All right, so the code that I support is 19 years old. It started in 2001, and as you know, there's a reason you're still supporting that old code. So I can't say this enough. The reason you're supporting that old code is because the product that the software that the product is running, or sorry, the other way around, has done a good job. You know, it's had a lot of success, and InboxDollars has had a lot of success. You might be asking yourself, why am I showing a picture of a spaceship? A few years ago, I read an article on Medium about, you know, sort of relating old code to this huge spaceship that's an interstellar spaceship. You know, I know there's not any that exist that we know of, but imagine, you know, a multi-generational people living on a spaceship that's traveling through stars. You know, the top level is where everybody lives. And you kind of live in that space 80% of the time, right? Once in a while, something breaks on the ship, and you got to venture down. So you start heading into these lower levels. And you don't know, when you go down to that lower level, something broke, you don't know if you go down there, you might be gone 10 minutes, you might be gone 2 weeks. There's a lot unknown in that lower level. So it really makes sense when you think of it as this huge ship. And the PHP code that InboxDollars has built over the last 19 years has a lot of these lower levels. Excuse me. Another good visualization is the Jenga. You probably see this a lot at talks. But basically, you know, you have developers pulling pieces out, adding pieces to the top. You never know which piece is that critical piece that's going to like break your entire app or throw something off that you don't see for a week. You know, things like that are happening. And this is a programmer. Anybody here have heard of Max? He works at Google. He works on a part of Google called Code Health. He's written a few books, and I highly recommend. You know, I do a lot of reading of programming, and if you don't really like to read books, his books are really good because they're easy to grasp and understand. So the whole point of this, and I'm going to kind of refer from the book of, you know, why this has worked for building products and, you know, development. When people decide at first what software to use, they have different criteria. You know, some do a lot of research, and eventually they come to decide and they pick your software because it has the features that you need. But once they've picked that program, they will stick with that program and keep using that software until there's a compelling reason to leave. So it's not like people are constantly looking around for new software to replace yours. They only start looking when your software just won't stop sucking. So you're rolling out code and, you know, you break stuff. You don't realize that this change affects this change and affects this change. Things like that. So this talk is going to be about how domain-driven design has helped InboxDollars suck less. Quick overview. InboxDollars is an app where people earn real money by doing online activities. For example, you can sign up for our website and register with like Netflix or Uber, and we'll give you extra money, you know, if you do it through our site. You can also watch videos, TV, And we make money by the advertising. You could play games. And another part of InboxDollars is market research, which is surveys, right? Everybody knows what surveys are. You see a lot of it, during the election season, things like that. So over 18 years of development, InboxDollars has written a lot of code. And the first 8 years was just straight raw PHP. And then about 10, 11 years ago, nobody really knows, unless you dig deep in the merge requests. 10 years ago, they switched to an MVC framework. Everyone here familiar with the MVC framework? I'm guessing you are since you're here. So we've been writing code in Cake PHP, which is the one of the top 5 frameworks for PHP. And so we've got lots of code, 500 models, 300 controllers. And this is just a check from a few weeks ago. And I didn't even take the time to try to figure out how many nested views there were, but there's over 1,000, probably a couple thousand views. Now, if you take it on the other side, the app gets a lot of traffic, right? So we're getting 15,000 or so, somewhere on there, new members signing up to our app every day. And speaking of market research, you're getting 300,000 survey entries every day. Just people trying surveys, so it's a high volume and a lot of code. And then diving a little bit deeper, to register you on our site, our sign-up method, which is buried inside a controller, is 1,397 lines. The survey controller, and this is from 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 3,500 lines, and then the controller itself uses about 10 different models. So, in general, we were breaking stuff quite a bit when I first started, myself included. I'm responsible for a lot of breaking. So for market research, things were, on the upper levels of this ship, everything seemed just fine. But when you rolled code out, you didn't realize, oh, this integration with this partner, from 6 years ago was buried inside this model, which called another model, things like that. So market research is, a huge space, and InboxDollars is the supplier. So we're the supplier as in we provide members to take all these surveys, and we get all the surveys from multiple partners. And I don't want to dive too much into the business model. It's kind of a crazy business model, different. But anyways, we've done a lot of integrations with partners over the last 15 years. And some of the code was from before the framework, just because it was so crazy complicated that we just moved it into the framework and referenced it inside a model or something like that. And integrations, as you probably are well aware, they set deadlines because the partner wants it done, to meet their quarter or things like that. So they were kind of rushed. And we never did the whole circle back to make it right. There's a lot of siloed development. We have really good programmers, developers at my company, but they're kind of working in silos. So there's no real standards. An immense amount of technical debt had built up, just by the numbers I showed you earlier. And I'm going to try to rush through some of these slides here to get to the meat of the presentation, and then hopefully have a lot of time for you guys to ask questions, because I feel like this is a big area, and I feel like there'll be a lot of good discussion. There's a lot of good, smart people here, so I want to have plenty of time towards the end. But feel free to interrupt me anytime. So anyways, we had no real standards. We had no modicum, how we want to write software. We just were writing software to meet project deadlines. And the main thing, I guess, we didn't have coding standards, but the main thing was to make the site highly performant. The page had to load within a second, because we didn't want our users, our members, to wait. So I'm going to highlight 3 critical areas of market research. And the first will be getting these live projects. And projects is sort of a term that we use in the company and with our partners. Projects are surveys. It's the same thing. So we're constantly querying API calls to our partners, and our partners have tens of thousands of surveys, and we may only care about a quarter of those surveys. So we have business logic to decide which surveys we want to pull in. And we're working with multiple partners, and the most critical part of this is to have the freshest data, because that's how you kind of give the best surveys to the members. You don't want to have surveys that are stale or no longer live. So this is a cron that was written in one partner integration. And we run it every few minutes to refresh the data. And who can guess where the business logic is in this survey? Or sorry, in this cron. There's a lot of cross-referencing. You're opening database connections, you're doing logging, and then in the middle of that is the critical business logic. So obviously it was really hard for other developers to work on this part of it, if you weren't the original developer. The second part of market research that I'm going to talk about is the matching. So now we've got all these thousands of surveys pulled down into our system, and then you want to show the best surveys to our members who have already taken sort of an upfront profiler. So they have a bunch of answers, and we want to match that to the survey's demographics, that buyer or someone like Target is looking for certain people to answer their surveys. So again, this is the legacy code, and this code was dropped into the controller, survey controller. And originally, all we had was surveys on one page of our site. It wasn't the most featured part of InboxDollars. So this worked, it wasn't that bad. Then, they're like, well, now we want to have surveys on different pages of this site. So that means you're pulling this code into different controllers. And we also have an app to support. 5-6 years ago, we created an app, so we have web services that need this code and need surveys. So again, this is one partner deciding which surveys to show to a member. So you've got a lot of looping, crazy looping going on. Calling cache, is this already in cache? No, it's not, so let's call the database. So you've got all this, 800 lines of code. And the problem was each new partner that we integrated with, you're basically just copying the business logic and you have it in multiple things. So again, go back to the Jenga, breaking stuff. The third part of market research that I'm going to talk about is scoring of projects. So you want to, and these are the bounded contexts, you can probably guess where I'm headed with this. So scoring of projects is another key factor. You want to separate the good from the bad, right? So you want to loop through all the surveys and then set a score using our algorithms. So again, this is a cron that's running every few minutes, and it's referencing models, and this is all in the back end. So here is the meat of this cron where we're deciding, which surveys we want to grade. If we even want to grade it, or if we want to just turn off that survey because it's really bad, a lot of bad surveys that we don't want our members to ever see. So mixed in here is the business logic. And again, who can find the secret sauce in here on when and why and how we grade a project? It's kind of hard to find. So you end up like searching code for the business logic. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about one pattern that we brought in from DDD, and it's the repository pattern. And I'm going to go through some real use cases, how we integrate it with the legacy, and how domain-driven design has changed, how we develop and how we iterate. But before I get into the fun parts and show a lot of code, just a quick slide about another thing. I love Simpsons, and I felt like Homer Simpson the first year at InboxDollars. A lot of my time was wasted by drive-by questions. And my answer was always like, oh, it's in the wiki. Oh, but wait, someone already made a change and the wiki no longer is valid. Well, and then a developer would ask me, where does this business logic live? I want to tweak it. Well, check the cron, then the model. But last month we put a split test in, so you need to look at the controller for that logic. And then we may have custom logic per part that was scattered, in the MVC framework. So a lot of developer time was wasted. And we were all experiencing this as a team because we didn't know a lot of the critical lower levels of the ship, of the spaceship, right? And developers come and go. So do product teams. Product teams have turnover. I think InboxDollars does a really good job of keeping people, but people come and go. So new employees bring up these same questions. And then one day, I was in a meeting, and I got asked this question. And Pluto is what we call our admin system. For some reason, 8 years ago, someone started naming all these things after planets. And Pluto is the last one. No longer a planet, and yeah, that's an inside joke. But so we wanted all that, someone asked me, I want all that logic for the live projects, getting the live projects, this huge cron that's, if I were to paste it in here, it'd be like this long. They wanted to be able to pick a number and say, give me survey X from partner B now, and just run it. And then sometimes I want to skip all the business logic and just give me that survey into our system. Because they have a really close relationship with all of our partners. And then, in the summer, and this is 2016, we also got a directive from above, we want to bring market research more of a prominent feature of InboxDollars. So at that time, I coincidentally had also attended a couple PHP conferences. And a couple of the talks really stood out. There was one by Andrew Castle, who I believe is speaking here, about DDD, and I had no idea what it was. It sounded cool, domain-driven design. But it got me thinking. It was kind of an awakening. So I started reading a lot, and on my own time, kind of experimenting with our code, not putting anything into production. And then, I started reading, the books about event storming, and I read a lot online about how to do it, how to start it. And I realized, the product team at InboxDollars was kind of already doing this. They were doing a fantastic job of bringing in the domain experts, which, in market research would be the partnerships team, and also including the developer and, with a product person, and we would whiteboard stuff out, and, it wouldn't just be one meeting and then the developer disappears. We're an agile shop. So I think we were doing pretty well with naming things, using the same language, same term. That was one thing that our legacy code had done pretty well. And I think it was mostly because the company is a very technical company. There's a lot of very smart people, a lot of business analysts, BI people. So there's a lot of technical people, and the owner of the company is a former developer. So it was very technical, and I think we were naming things properly because we knew we should. We weren't naming users in code, we were naming them members, because that's what they were. They were a member to InboxDollars. So we didn't really realize it, but we were kind of already doing that. So a couple of months after I learned, DDD, I decided to make a first change. And I didn't just say, I'm going to do domain-driven design, see you in 6 months. I wanted to do it with a feature request. So I started it very small, very simple. And it's just a repository that replaced all this huge cron that had all the API calls nested inside of it. So like a survey has, we have thousands of surveys in our API calls. And inside each one, there's several sub-API calls. So in one call to the partner, you end up making thousands of separate API calls. So I made a common interface for all of our partners. They kind of are all doing the same thing, but not exactly. So this was the first change. It was a feature request to include categories or verticals and what the term is topics with a survey. This doesn't really look like DDD, but it was the first change, where I was pulling stuff out of the MVC framework in a separate folder. And I'll show more of that in a little bit. So again, it's just, I was doing a data transformation object, and I created a API interface that all of our partners could use. Excuse me. And that allowed me to create a repository which could wrap all that stuff inside of it. And a little bit about the repository pattern. These are just things I pulled off Eric's book. Now reading that book, how many people have read the book? How many people understood it within the first week? Not me, no. It took a while, so it kind of had to set in. But the repository pattern stood out, and I read about it a lot, on other blog posts and things like that. So I decided that it really met the market research channel and what we needed from that, and the confusion that was happening and the breaking of stuff that was happening. So using the repository pattern really made sense. And then, I spent a lot of time trying to champion DDD at the company. So this was a quote that I read on Quora, where someone posed the question, like, why DDD? And the answer that really sunk with me, and it hit home with a lot of the upper management at InboxDollars, was complex. If you have complex business rules that need to be executed the same time, or the same every time, DDD makes sense. And that totally encapsulates why DDD was a good use case. Okay, so I've got 3 use cases. I'm going to dive in and show you some code of how we use the repository pattern, and then there'll be time for questions. So the first use case is merging data from different data sources. The main thing of InboxDollars is to have everything super fast. Now originally, 10 years ago, we just built multiple servers of databases. And then basically you had the main, sort of the legacy system of data, and then you had the newer one, and then basically it just became this crazy ball of mud of database servers. But it worked, it was fast. The problem was is in the code, in MVC, we have 400 models, right? And unfortunately, in Cake PHP, the version that we're on, I think the newer version helps this, but you can't break apart models into modules or subfolders. So you just have this huge list. And because of our database environment, you end up having models calling other models, because you can't just do one query because they're different servers. So using the repository pattern really helped to pull stuff together. And we also got away from using MySQL. We started using Redis. So I wanted to use some of that in market research. So my first change, and this wasn't just, I just rewrote some code and rolled it. It went along with a new integration. So I think that's a key part, is you don't just refactor code to refactor it. I think you need to refactor it as part of a new feature. So there's some value for the business. You're not just changing the code and half the business doesn't really care. But I basically created a service, and this is probably the 8th iteration that finally seemed to make sense. And basically I created a service, and within that service, for getting the live projects, there was one for each partner. And the 4 things here I highlighted. First one, getting the data using the repository. So you have this get all function. And inside the repository, you're basically calling their API, getting a list of surveys and some other data, and the aggregate became an object called live projects. So the get all function returns the aggregate, and the aggregate accepts a partner object and an array of projects. And the nice thing about having this repository, as sort of an aside, is when I talk to the technical team with our partners, I can easily tell them which API calls we're making because they're all in this file. All right, so back to the service. So now we've got this huge list of surveys, and if you remember from the beginning, we only care about maybe 10% of those surveys. So we have business logic, and that's what we're doing with the aggregate. We're going to filter down all those surveys. Excuse me. And right here is all our domain logic now. Everything else is distilled. You've got the filters that we're doing. Is this survey in English? No, we don't care about that survey. We only care about certain kinds of surveys. And we don't want surveys that collect personal information, so we ignore all of those. And in the end, it builds an array of live projects. So then once you have that, and this next part might seem a little wonky, but there was a reason I had to do it this way. So we have all these thousands of surveys. Most of them, like I said, we don't care about, but most of them are already in our system. So once we have filtered out the surveys we don't want, then we end up with like maybe 2,000 surveys. So the reason I'm doing this call later in the repository is because there's all these sub-API calls, and if you did it all up front, this cron would take way too long to run. So doing it this way, you map the sub-data to each survey, and then we're also calling our model to get the unique identifier. We're still using the database record as the unique identifier. So now back to the service. So we've gotten all the surveys, we've filtered them out, we've mapped all the sub-data, and now we're ready to save it into our system. And again, it's very critical that this is super fast. It's a differentiator in the business to have the freshest, most current data. So now we save it. And half the developers that work on this don't really care about how that data gets saved. They might only care about changing the filters or adding a new one or having a different filter for a specific partner. So that's first use case. Second use case is separation of concerns. And I'm going to talk about how we grade projects, separating the good from the bad. Having things separated, I've kind of touched on it a little bit already, really helps and is a game changer at InboxDollars because you remove all the concerns of how you query the database, how you query the partner's API. The domain experts, the partnerships team at InboxDollars doesn't care about that. They only care about how what are you doing with that data? What are the rules? So I created another service that scores surveys, and basically it just walks through, very similar to the other one. I decided to kind of make the code similar so that it would be easier for other developers to get on board. So these are the three main parts where we're calling the repository. We have different algorithms, and they're in a split test. So the first one just gets the main aggregate root, and then we get the partners that we want to grade. We have many partners that we integrate with. So quickly, this is the SQL repository, which is only calling our databases. And you can see here, we pass in, let me step back a sec. So we get our partners, and then we're looping through those partners. And within each partner, there's projects that we might want to grade and not grade. So you pass into the get projects to grade. Hopefully everybody can see that. You pass in a partner, and then you pull back all the surveys that have had activity recently. And basically the main object that gets passed back is a project to grade, which is what we're trying to do here. Now, the nice thing about having a separate class for each partner is we can then have different variables. And before, these variables were kind of scattered. They were either a constant, in the bootstrap of the application, or they were defined in the database because they were different per, instance. But now we have it all here. So now you don't have to dig around looking and trying to find things. So you're no longer going into the depths of hell, as we can see here, of the code, trying to find things. It's all right in one class. So back to the service. Now we've got our projects we want to grade, we're looping through them, and now we get into the main part of what we're trying to show here is the grading of projects. And this is newer code, and so a couple weeks ago I had a meeting to go over what changes we want to make to this. I just pulled up this file. I didn't bring in notes. I didn't have to look up anything. I can just immediately come into a meeting, pull up this file. And eventually, I might not even have to be in that meeting, because I know developers don't like to be in lots of meetings, right? But it makes sense to most people. I think, what we're trying to do here is pretty obvious. You're looking through a project. Does it have recent completes? No, it doesn't. That means it's probably a really crappy survey. So we want to get that off our list so the members don't see it anymore. And a lot of this is, domain ubiquitous language that we developed. As I said before, we were kind of already doing the event storming and naming things right, but I also did a check, as I was writing this code, does this make sense to you? So it was an iterative process. But now, the experts that work with our partners, they can look at this and be, well, this is wrong for this reason, and we should change that or add to this. Everything is right here. So insights are made. Quick decisions are made. You're no longer saying, well, let me check on that and I'll get back to you. And then there's this sort of, the meeting drags on for a couple days through email. Another important part of using the repository pattern is being able to write unit tests. So here's an example of feeding in static data using a test repository that implements the same interface as the real repository. So it's very simple to write tests. You don't have to sit there and do all these crazy things to make things work, especially if you're not using the standard way that Cake PHP expects you to write a unit test. Because we're using Redis, we're not using MySQL for a lot of the data lookups on the front end. The last use case I'm going to cover is the breaking away of the MVC framework. So I've kind of touched on it a little bit, but basically breaking away allows you to establish a hierarchy. The company's intellectual property is much more important than the framework. The Cake PHP framework has been around for a long time, and 10 years ago it was one of the top frameworks for PHP developers to, open source framework. Nowadays it's probably 5th, 6th on the list, and you don't see a lot of people starting new products using Cake PHP. So having the intellectual property outside of the frameworks is a huge advantage in my opinion, because I think it'll obviously outlive the framework. The company's been around since 2001, so it's going to be longer than Cake PHP in my mind. I mean, we're not going to change our framework, but I feel like having it outside is a huge thing. So just a quick slide here. This is the standard setup. Hopefully you guys can all see that, but basically this is your default setup for Cake PHP. Controller model view folder, and there's also a console folder. And what we did is we added this outside the framework structure where we implemented the DDD stuff. And over the last 2 years, over time, we've built our core domains. So these are the bounded contexts, and this is what makes up market research. So again, matching the right surveys at the right time to our members is very important. So before, all that logic was kind of in multiple places. Now you just have to make one call. And I decided I'm reading through a lot of the materials on DDD. that the facade really made sense in this case because it allows space between the legacy system and the domain. So the highlighted part here that you can see, we're able to do a couple things that really have nothing to do with surveys. We have a fraud detection where we don't want some members to even see surveys. And then we have a split test happening where we want to pull that in. So you're able to also then pass in the repository, and you're able to pass in the mapper class, which will translate the domain to the legacy. And stepping into the service, basically it's similar to the other examples. You want to get your object, your main aggregate, and in this case it's a matched member aggregate, which just accepts a profile of a member. And right at the top, we're calling a model to get the member results. And this is an existing model that was there before domain-driven design, any of this. So now we're using the models inside the repository and able to pass that into the aggregate. So back to the service. Now we have all the members' answers. Next step is to get all the projects that are currently live in our system. So I have a second repository called the project repository. And inside there, it's using Redis to query things. And if you're familiar with Redis, it's pretty standard calls. You just call in a hash and you pass the array of projects, which is an object in our domain. So then you get to the true part where you distilled everything else and you want to match that member to this project. So you're looping through all the live projects. And we have business rules right here. And again, you can sit there and pull this file up. And everybody can understand it, that technical, non-technical. So we have some rules here, and I've chopped down this function just so we can all see it here. But you have a few things. You don't want a member to see the same survey twice. Does that member have the right qualification for the survey? Which means, a survey might have a qualification of being in Denver. So we map that to the member zip code. And then it just creates an array of matches. And again, here we are. We can easily test all of this. You just have to pass in a test repository. And in this test, we have a JSON file that contains static partner projects that we've pulled in at one point as a snapshot. And then you can run the service, and your code is pretty much covered, at least the most important parts of it. So unit testing is a huge feature that comes out of using the repository pattern. All right, so that is the last use case. So overall, I think it's been a long road. I think it was the right road to take, in my opinion, looking back, to do it slowly but surely. And I feel like now we have more efficient decision making when we sit in a meeting, and we have less meetings, which is good. And we have code now that is testable, easily testable, and can be run every time we roll code to production, which in our case, we're rolling code to production sometimes 2-3 times a day. So there is time for questions. So as was stated, use the microphone, please. Any questions? All right, got one.
So you had done a bunch of reading about domain-driven design, and my sense is that you had an idea that, okay, I'm going to try this, and it's probably going to work. So were there any interesting things that surprised you while you were doing this that said, oh, I didn't think, I can't believe that, that's awesome, that happened, I can't believe it?
Well, that's a great question. The testability was something that I didn't really realize. 2-3 years ago, I wasn't writing a lot of unit tests. That was a great bonus. But there were a lot of things that were revealed. Obviously, I had the advantage of there was already this legacy system running. And yes, the company wanted to grow it, but I kind of knew the structure of it, and I worked very closely with all the experts, so it was kind of easy. But there were things that were revealed that made the code a lot more expressive and a lot more readable. So yeah, good question.
Did you find any errors in the old business rules? Did you have to compare yourself against them?
That's a great question. I did. There were a lot of, as you probably, if you listen to half this presentation, there's a lot of complicated business rules. And yeah, when I went through, I realized that we were using older versions of our partner API. And I did have that issue where I didn't have existing unit tests to compare against. So it was a lot of like manual testing at first. But yeah, I did nicely, you know, everybody probably uses Slack. You know, I have very close relationships with the technical team on the partner end, so I could like ask them questions as I was going through it, like, is this right? So I think, you know, the old stuff was 80, 90% right, but it worked, you know, and obviously we had success with each of these partners, but I think in the end, doing it this way made the integration much better.
I guess my question is, you said this code base is 19 years old? That's what you said. Did you hit a point where you're like, let's just burn this to the ground? I'm serious. Like, why?
Well, there is a story that there's a developer at my company that's been there 10 years. So he has the like knowledge of the long, long ago of what happened. And I think at one point there was some developers that came on, they're like, let's wipe this out, you know, scratch it all off and start over. And I think that didn't go well. So upper management, you know, they're not going to allow a rewrite. And we're so far in. So market research is probably 25% of our overall code base. So it just, yeah. I would probably prefer that, but no.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. And the other question I had was, so you just went off and explored this on your own. You're like, I'm going to implement DDD on my own. And the other developers, I know you said they worked in silos. Were they aware of what you were up to?
Only a couple. Yeah, I worked with the director of development, and we were talking a lot about this, and they were on board, and then the CTO was on board. But yeah, it was a lot of late nights. I was kind of inspired by other people's talks and stuff like that, and it really made sense. So I kind of went on the path of, I'm gonna just write some code and then show it to them. And that's kind of the process I went through. I showed them my experiments. Instead of just trying to sell it, by talking or doing a presentation like this, I showed them examples of how much simpler the code could be.
And then how hard was it at that point? I'm sorry, that's the last question I
Go
probably.
ahead.
Okay, and then how hard was it at that point to convince them to say this is a better approach? Because people come into work. People come into work, they know exactly what they do every day. They're like, I'm familiar with this architecture. Now you rock their world a little bit. Do you understand my question?
Yeah. No, fortunately, I have a really great manager, the director of development. She really is a proponent on looking at newer things. And we had built up so much technical debt that we were just looking for new ideas. So that's why I think it was good timing.
Probably have time for one more. Anybody got one? Well, I'll go ahead and ask one then.
Oh, sure.
So you talked quite a bit about repositories and some of these things that Vernon likes to call the tactical patterns. And you touched a little bit on ubiquitous language and some of the things. To me, I think everybody takes different things away from their readings of these things. To me, the most interesting parts of domain-driven design are ubiquitous language and bounded contexts. So did you have some experience with applying bounded contexts as well?
For sure, yeah. And I probably should have a couple more slides on that, but let me go back. Went too far. So this slide is our bounded context in that domain folder. And that was a lot of like back and forth through email, through Slack, face-to-face of trying to break apart. Because before it was just this huge, file. And it would break often. So developing the bounded context took time, and it was kind of happening at the same time I was kind of on the side experimenting with domain-driven design. I would check in with the partnerships team, which I work really closely with. And luckily, the nice part about InboxDollars is there's only 40 employees, and we're all in the same office. So it was easy to just walk over to someone's desk and be like, does this make sense to you? I'm trying to simplify a lot of this stuff. So there was a lot of, process that was happening kind of, in the kitchen or things like that, kind of informally.
All right, well, thanks, Dave.
You got one behind you.
Oh, you got one more? Okay, let's go ahead and do that.
Yeah, related to what he's saying, how often did you discover you were incorrect about your boundaries? And how did you discover it? And what was it like refactoring to get them to what you thought was right?
Yeah, I was wrong a lot. At first I had kind of like 2 or 3 different contexts, and then I realized it just didn't make sense, to be doing all this stuff. So there was back and forth on my own, in my own head, and also just talking with the partnerships manager who works so closely with our partners. So there was a lot of discovery and failures. I've done a talk in the past about failing fast. This was not failing fast. It was like iteratively failing and trying things and experimenting. And this isn't perfect by any means, but it's close. It's a lot better than it was.
That's not all we have time for.
All right, well, thank you.